The Victorian house loomed at the end of a cobblestone street, its dark silhouette stark against the gray sky. Its Airbnb listing boasted charm, history, and the promise of solitude. To Megan, it seemed like the perfect escape from the chaos of her life, a place to think, recharge, and maybe even write again. The host, a man named Richard, had received glowing reviews for his attentiveness, though Megan was relieved he'd promised to give her privacy. The house was even more imposing in person. As Megan stepped inside, the scent of aged wood and lavender polish filled her nose. The interior was a labyrinth of shadowy corridors and creaking floors. Richard gave her a quick tour, pointing out the essentials: the kitchen, her bedroom, and the library, a sunlit space filled with dusty books. He mentioned, almost in passing, that several rooms upstairs were off limits. "They're locked for storage," he said, his smile thin. "Nothing of interest up there." Megan nodded, barely listening, too taken with the grandeur of the space. But as Richard's footsteps faded and the front door clicked shut, she felt an odd stillness settle over the house. Her first night was uneventful, though she woke once to what she thought was a faint creaking sound. She brushed it off as the old house settling and drifted back to sleep. The next morning, however, she noticed something strange. The door to one of the locked rooms was slightly ajar. Megan's rational mind immediately jumped to an explanation. Richard must have forgotten to lock it. But when she pushed the door open, she found only darkness. The room smelled musty, as though it hadn't been opened in decades. Dust motes danced in the light filtering through a single grimy window. The furniture was covered with sheets, and in the center of the room sat a small, child-sized chair, facing a mirror. The sight unsettled her, and she quickly shut the door, resolving to ignore it. But as the days passed, her unease grew. She began hearing whispers at night, faint and indecipherable, like voices carried on the wind. She dismissed them as her imagination, but the next morning she found muddy footprints trailing from the staircase to the kitchen. Megan called Richard, her voice shaky. "Has anyone else been in the house?" she asked. "No," he replied firmly. "You're the only guest. Are you sure you didn't track in something yourself?" His tone was calm, but something about the way he spoke made her stomach tighten. That night, she locked her bedroom door, a habit she hadn't thought necessary until now. The whispers grew louder as the week went on, and Megan found herself drawn to the locked rooms. Each time she passed one, she felt an almost magnetic pull, as though the house was urging her to open them. One afternoon, she gave in. She tried the handles, jiggling each one until she reached the last door at the end of the hall. To her surprise, it swung open easily. Inside, she found a bedroom eerily untouched, as if someone had left it only moments before. The bed was neatly made, and a pair of shoes sat at the foot of it. On the nightstand was a framed photograph of a woman and a little boy, their smiles frozen in time. As Megan studied the photo, her breath hitched. The boy looked vaguely familiar. She couldn't place why, until she saw a reflection of the same child in the mirror on the opposite wall, except the reflection wasn't a photograph. It moved. Megan stumbled back, her heart racing, and the door slammed shut behind her. She yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The whispers were deafening now, and as she turned, she saw the boy standing in the corner of the room, his eyes wide and dark. "Help us," he whispered, his voice trembling. The lights flickered, and the room began to spin. Megan screamed, pounding on the door until it finally gave way. She stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. Her instinct was to leave immediately, but as she packed her things, she realized her car keys were missing. Frantic, she searched every corner of the house, but the keys were nowhere to be found. Then, she remembered the journal. She had found it in the library earlier that week, tucked away on a high shelf. The leather-bound book had been filled with illegible scrawls, but one page had stood out. "They watch us from the mirrors. Don't look too long or they'll pull you in." Heart pounding, Megan returned to the library. The journal was gone. A sound from the kitchen drew her attention, a metallic clink, like keys being dropped onto the counter. Cautiously she approached, but the kitchen was empty. Her keys lay in the center of the counter. Relieved but wary, she grabbed them and turned to leave. Standing in the doorway was Richard. "I told you not to go into those rooms," he said, his voice low. Megan backed away, clutching her keys. "What is this place? What's going on here?" Richard's smile was cold. "The house has needs, and you're not the first to try and leave." The lights flickered again, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. Shadows began to move along the walls, stretching toward Megan. She bolted, running for the front door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was Richard's face, distorted and monstrous, grinning as the whispers turned to screams. When the house was listed again a week later, it already had another glowing review. The cabin stood alone on the edge of a glassy lake, surrounded by thick pine trees that seemed to close in as the sun dipped below the horizon. Its listing was idyllic, a secluded lakeside retreat with all the comforts of home. Emma had booked it for a quiet weekend away, desperate for peace after months of sleepless nights and mounting stress at work. She arrived at dusk, her car crunching over the gravel driveway. The cabin was rustic but charming, with a wide porch that overlooked the lake. As she stepped inside, Emma felt an odd chill, despite the cozy interior. The air smelled faintly of damp wood and something metallic like rust. She carried her bags to the bedroom, where her attention was immediately drawn to the mirror. It was massive, an ornate antique with a frame of dark, intricately carved wood. It stood on a heavy base near the foot of the bed, its surface oddly cloudy, as though it had absorbed the cabin's years of isolation. Emma hesitated for a moment, staring at her reflection, which seemed slightly off. The lighting, maybe? Shrugging it off, she turned away and began unpacking. The first night was uneventful, though she woke once, feeling as if she were being watched. The sensation was fleeting, but it left her uneasy. She tried to convince herself it was just the unfamiliar surroundings playing tricks on her. The second night, the whispers began, faint at first, like a breeze rustling through the trees, but distinctly human. Emma sat up in bed, straining to hear. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the mirror. She approached it cautiously, her reflection pale and trembling in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. As she leaned closer, she thought she saw movement behind. Whipping around, she found only the empty room. Shaking her head, she laughed nervously. "Get a grip, Emma," she muttered, climbing back into bed. By the third day, she couldn't ignore the strangeness anymore. Her phone battery, fully charged when she arrived, inexplicably drained overnight. Objects seemed to shift position when she wasn't looking. A coffee mug left on the counter appeared on the dining table, and a chair she'd moved to the corner was back by the window. Her unease deepened when she noticed something peculiar in the mirror. She was brushing her hair that evening when she caught sight of her reflection. At first glance, it seemed normal, but as she watched, her reflection smiled. Emma hadn't moved. Her stomach twisted as she stepped closer, her breath fogging the glass. The reflection was still smiling, its eyes darker, its teeth sharper than her own. She stumbled back, her heart pounding, and grabbed a blanket to cover the mirror. That night, the whispers grew louder, turning into a chorus of voices. They didn't speak words, but moaned in a low, guttural hum that set her teeth on edge. The blanket covering the mirror began to ripple, as if something on the other side were pushing against it. Terrified, Emma packed her bags in the middle of the night, determined to leave. But when she stepped outside, the forest seemed denser than before, the path to her car obscured by trees that hadn't been there when she arrived. She returned to the cabin, her panic mounting. The mirror was uncovered again, though she was certain she hadn't touched it. Her reflection stared at her, unmoving, as though mocking her. Desperate for answers, Emma searched the cabin and found a hidden compartment beneath a loose floorboard in the living room. Inside was a journal, its pages yellowed with age. The entries were erratic, the handwriting deteriorating as the pages went on. "The mirror is a doorway," one entry read. "It shows you what it wants you to see. It hungers for." The final page was smeared with ink and something darker, the words barely legible. "Don't look too long. Don't let it out." Emma felt the hairs on her neck rise. A sudden gust of wind slammed the cabin door shut, and the mirror rattled violently. She turned to see her reflection grinning at her again, its hands pressed against the glass from the other side. "No," she whispered, backing away. "No, this isn't real." The reflection tilted its head, mocking her terror. Slowly, its hand reached out, pushing against the surface of the mirror until the glass rippled like water. Emma screamed, grabbing the nearest object, a fireplace poker, and swinging it at the mirror. The glass shattered, shards flying across the room. For a moment, there was silence. Then the voices roared, a deafening cacophony that shook the cabin. Emma stumbled back, her eyes wide as she saw the fragments of the mirror begin to move, each shard reflecting not her, but dozens of pale, grinning faces. She fled the cabin, crashing through the forest until she reached her car. To her relief, the path was clear again. She sped away, the cabin shrinking in her rearview mirror, but the unease lingered. Days later, as she unpacked at home, Emma found a small shard of glass at the bottom of her bag. It was from the mirror. She was certain of it. As she held it up to the light, her blood ran cold. Her reflection in the shard was smiling. The whispers began again that night. It was supposed to be a perfect escape, A small-town apartment with charm, privacy, and all the comforts of home. Dan had chosen the Airbnb for its excellent reviews, each one praising the host, Claire, for her warm hospitality and attention to detail. After a messy breakup and months of stress at work, Dan needed somewhere quiet to clear his head. Claire's cozy listing seemed like the ideal place. When Dan arrived, Claire greeted him with a wide smile and a plate of freshly baked cookies. She was a woman in her late 40s, with sharp eyes and a calm, almost motherly demeanor. She showed him around the apartment, which was quaint but spotless, with vintage decor that gave it character. "If you need anything at all," Claire said, her voice soft and reassuring, "I live just downstairs. Feel free to knock any time." Dan thanked her, appreciating the personal touch. Still, he hoped he wouldn't need her much. He was here for solitude, not company. The first night passed uneventfully. The apartment was quiet, almost eerily so, but Dan chalked it up to the unfamiliar surrounding. By the second night, though, he began to notice things that felt off. It started with the feeling of being watched. As Dan sat in the living room scrolling through his phone, he couldn't shake the sensation that someone was standing behind him. Every time he turned around, the room was empty. The following morning, Dan woke to find his suitcase open and his clothes scattered across the floor. Frowning, he gathered them up, assuming he'd left the latch loose. But something about the way his belongings were strewn felt deliberate. He also noticed his phone, which he'd left on the nightstand, was now on the kitchen counter. Dan mentioned the strange occurrences to Claire when he bumped into her on his way out to grab groceries. "Oh, this old place has its quirks," she said with a knowing smile. "The floors creak and sometimes things shift around. Don't let it bother you." Her response felt too casual, almost dismissive, but Dan let it go. That night, things escalated. Around 2 a.m., Dan awoke to the sound of faint humming. It was a soft, melodic tune, the kind a mother might sing to a child. Sitting up in bed, he strained to listen. The sound seemed to be coming from the walls. He got up and followed the noise, his pulse quickening as it grew louder near the bedroom closet. Slowly, he opened the door, revealing only his hanging clothes and a few extra blankets. The humming stopped abruptly. Dan closed the closet, his hands trembling. As he turned to head back to bed, he froze. The door to the apartment, which he'd locked before going to sleep, was wide open. The next morning, Dan confronted Claire. "Has anyone else been in the apartment?" he asked, his voice shaky. Claire looked surprised, then concerned. "Of course not. I wouldn't allow that." She placed a hand on his arm. "You're probably just overtired. These old buildings can play tricks on you." Dan wanted to believe her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't telling him everything. That evening, he set up his laptop's webcam to record while he slept, determined to catch any intruders. He woke to another odd scene. His chair had been moved to face the bedroom door, and his blanket was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. He immediately checked the recording. What he saw made his blood run cold. The footage showed him sleeping soundly, but just after 3 a.m., the bedroom door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, moving slowly. It was Claire. She stood at the foot of the bed, watching him for several minutes, before silently adjusting the blanket and leaving the room. Dan felt sick. He packed his things in a hurry and prepared to leave, but as he opened the door, Claire was standing there, blocking his path. "Going somewhere?" she asked, her voice calm but unnervingly cold. Dan's throat tightened. I have to leave early. Something came up." Claire tilted her head, her sharp eyes narrowing. "That's a shame. I thought we were getting along so well." Her words sent a shiver down his spine. He stepped past her, forcing himself not to run, and made it to his car. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw her standing in the doorway, watching him leave. When he returned home, Dan reported the incident to Airbnb, but when he checked the listing a few days later, it was gone. There was no trace of Claire or her apartment anywhere on the platform. Months later, Dan received an anonymous email with no subject line. Attached was a single photo, a blurry image of him sleeping in the apartment, taken from the foot of the bed. The message read, "You forgot to say goodbye." Jared had always been a skeptic. Ghost stories, urban legends, and tales of the supernatural never fazed him. So when his girlfriend Mia suggested a weekend getaway at a rural Airbnb known for its quirky charm, he laughed off the odd details she shared from the reviews: strange noises, flickering lights, and an unexplainable atmosphere. "Perfect," Jared joked as they pulled into the gravel driveway. "Just the right mix of rustic and creepy." The house was small and weathered, perched on a hill overlooking an overgrown meadow. Its faded yellow paint was peeling, and the porch sagged in places. A rusty weather vane spun lazily on the roof, creaking in the wind. "Quaint," Mia said, trying to sound optimistic as they unloaded their bags. Inside, the house was sparse but functional, with mismatched furniture and a faint smell of mothballs. Jared immediately noticed a collection of porcelain dolls on a high shelf in the living room. Their wide, glassy eyes seemed to follow him as he moved. "This place has character," he quipped, setting their bags down. The first evening passed uneventfully. They cooked dinner, played cards, and laughed about the outdated decor. But as the sun set, an uneasy stillness settled over the house. At midnight, they were jolted awake by a loud bang. Jared leapt out of bed, his heart pounding. He found the front door wide open, swinging slightly in the breeze. "Did you lock it?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "Of course I did," Jared replied, shutting it firmly and sliding the deadbolt into place. He checked the windows and doors, ensuring everything was secure. But as he walked back to the bedroom, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. One of the porcelain dolls from the shelf was now on the coffee table, sitting upright. "Mia, did you move this?" Jared called out. "What are you talking about?" she replied from the bedroom, her tone confused. Jared didn't answer. Instead, he picked up the doll and placed it back on the shelf. He told himself it must have fallen somehow, though the way it had been positioned on the table seemed deliberate. The next morning, Jared found muddy footprints leading from the front door to the kitchen. They were small, like those of a child. "Mia, did you come out here last night?" he asked, though he already knew her answer. She shook her head. "I stayed in bed the whole time. You know that." Jared's skepticism began to waver. He cleaned up the footprints, trying to mask his growing unease. That night, things took a darker turn. As they lay in bed, they heard soft footsteps in the hallway outside their door. Jared grabbed a flashlight and swung the door open, but the hallway was empty. When he turned back, Mia gasped. "Jared," she whispered, pointing to the floor. There, just inside the bedroom, sat one of the porcelain dolls. Its head was tilted to the side, and its painted lips seemed to curl into a mocking smile. Jared picked it up, his hands shaking. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, carrying the doll to the living room and placing it in a cupboard. He slammed the door shut and returned to bed, but neither of them slept. At 3 a.m., they woke to the sound of something scraping against the floor. Jared turned on the light and his blood ran cold. The cupboard door was wide open and all the dolls were lined up in a row on the floor, facing the bedroom. "We're leaving," Mia said, her voice firm but panicked. They threw their belongings into their bags and headed for the door. But as Jared reached for the handle, he felt a sharp, icy breeze. The door wouldn't budge. "Come on," he yelled, pulling with all his strength. Behind them, the dolls began to shift. Slowly, one by one, they turned their heads toward the couple. "Jared," Mia whimpered, clutching his arm. The air grew heavy and a low, guttural hum filled the room. Shadows stretched across the walls, twisting and writhing like living things. Jared grabbed a chair and smashed it against a window, shattering the glass. He helped Mia climb out, then followed, their breaths coming in frantic gasps as they sprinted to the car. As they sped down the dark, empty road, Mia glanced back at the house. In the upstairs window, she saw a small figure watching them. It wasn't a person. The next day, Jared contacted the Airbnb host to demand an explanation. The host sounded genuinely surprised, but admitted the house had a history. "It's been in my family for generations," the host said. "My grandmother used to collect those dolls. She believed they were protectors, but some guests have said they feel differently about them." Jared deleted the app that night. Weeks later, he received a package with no return address. Inside was a single porcelain doll. Its head was tilted to the side, and its painted lips curled into that same mocking smile. Lisa had always loved the ocean. Growing up near the coast, she felt most at peace with the sound of waves crashing and the salty breeze on her face. So, when she found an Airbnb listing for a secluded beachfront bungalow with panoramic views of the sea, she booked it without hesitation. The photos were stunning. A cozy modern home perched on a rocky cliff overlooking the water, far from the noise of the city. The description mentioned that the property was accessible only by a narrow dirt road, which added to its allure. When Lisa arrived, the reality was even better than the pictures. The bungalow was immaculate, with large windows that showcased the ocean in all its glory. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, and the rhythmic sound of the waves was soothing. The host, an elderly man named Mr. Carter, greeted her at the door. He was polite but distant, handing her the keys and a printed set of rules. "Enjoy your stay," he said, his voice flat. "But don't go outside after dark." Lisa chuckled nervously. "Why not?" Mr. Carter's expression didn't change. "The tide comes in fast, and the cliffs can be dangerous. Just stay inside." With that, he turned and left, his old pickup truck disappearing down the dirt road. Lisa shrugged off his warning. The place was gorgeous, and she had no intention of wandering around in the dark anyway. The first day passed peacefully. Lisa explored the bungalow, admired the views, and spent hours sitting on the porch, watching the waves crash against the rocks below. As the sun set, the ocean seemed to glow, the water reflecting hues of orange and pink. That night, as she was brushing her teeth, Lisa heard a faint sound. It was a soft tapping, like knuckles rapping on glass. She froze, listening intently. The sound came again, louder this time. She walked into the living room, where the largest windows faced the ocean. The tapping stopped as she approached. Peering outside, she saw only the dark expanse of the sea and the faint outline of the cliffs below. Must be the wind, she muttered, trying to ignore the unease creeping up her spine. The second night, the tapping returned. This time it was more insistent, coming from multiple windows at once. Lisa felt her heart race as she checked each window, finding nothing but the pitch-black night beyond. She double-checked the locks on all the doors and windows, then crawled into bed, trying to convince herself it was just the house settling or some animal outside. At 3 a.m., she woke to a new sound, a low, mournful wailing, like someone crying far away. The sound ebbed and flowed, rising and falling with the rhythm of the waves. Lisa pulled the covers tighter around herself, every nerve on edge. The wailing continued for hours, making sleep impossible. When dawn finally broke, the sound faded with the light. Determined to shake off her fear, Lisa spent the next day hiking along the cliffs and taking photos of the stunning scenery. She avoided the waterline, remembering Mr. Carter's warning about the tide. As she returned to the bungalow that afternoon, she noticed something strange. There were wet footprints leading from the edge of the cliffs to her porch. They were small, like those of a child, and stopped abruptly at her front door. Lisa's stomach churned. She told herself it must be a trick of the rain earlier that morning, though the sky had been clear since she arrived. That night, the tapping started earlier. Lisa locked herself in the bedroom, refusing to investigate. But as the hours passed, the tapping grew louder, almost frantic. Then came the voice. "Let me in," it whispered, soft but unmistakable. Lisa bolted upright in bed, her breath catching in her throat. "Let me in," the voice repeated, more insistent this time. She grabbed her phone and dialed Mr. Carter. He answered on the second ring. "I told you to stay inside at night," he said, his tone sharp. "I am inside," Lisa hissed. "Someone's outside, tapping on the windows, whispering." "Don't open the door," Mr. Carter interrupted. "No matter what you hear, don't open the door." Lisa's blood turned cold. What's going on? But Mr. Carter hung up. The voice grew louder, shifting from a whisper to a raspy, pleading cry. "Please let me in. It's so cold out here. Please." Lisa curled into a corner of the room, clutching her phone like a lifeline. The voice continued, accompanied by the relentless tapping. Hours passed, and eventually the noises stopped. When the first rays of sunlight filtered through the windows, Lisa mustered the courage to step outside. The footprints were back, leading from the cliffs to her porch and then circling the bungalow. They were deeper this time, as though someone or something had lingered. Lisa packed her things and left that morning, not waiting for Mr. Carter or anyone else. Days later, unable to shake her curiosity, she looked up the property online. An old news article, "Local Family Drowns in Cliffside Tragedy." The article detailed how a family of 4 had been swept away by a rogue wave while exploring the cliffs. Their bodies were never recovered. Lisa stared at the grainy photo accompanying the article. In the background, she recognized the bungalow, looking eerily unchanged. Late that night, as she lay in her own bed, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number. "Let me in," it read. And then came the tapping on her bedroom window.